April 12, 1945. The war in Europe had less than a month to live, but nobody told that to the 5 boys crouched in a bombed-out farmhouse outside the German town of Halberstadt. They wore uniforms that hung loose on their thin frames, carried rifles nearly as tall as they were, and believed with the fierce certainty of youth that they were soldiers defending the fatherland. The oldest among them had just turned 17. The youngest was 14 and still waiting for his voice to finish changing. They were members of the Volkssturm, Germany's last desperate attempt to hold back the advancing Allied forces by arming anyone who could hold a weapon, regardless of age or training. For weeks they had been told that American soldiers were monsters who took no prisoners, who executed German fighters on sight, who showed no mercy to anyone wearing a Wehrmacht uniform. These boys believed every word. Helmut Schroeder, 16 years old and from a farming family in Istad, Prussia, had been appointed their squad leader not because of any military experience, but simply because he was the tallest and could read maps. He stood at the farmhouse window, watching American tanks roll across the distant fields with an inevitability that made his stomach clench with fear. Beside him, 15-year-old Dieter Volkmann cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time that hour, his hands shaking so badly that he nearly dropped the weapon. Dieter had joined the Volkssturm 2 months earlier when his father was killed on the Eastern Front, leaving him as the only male in his family. He felt a crushing responsibility to prove himself worthy of his father's sacrifice, even though he had never fired his rifle at anything but tin cans. In the corner of the room, 14-year-old Klaus Werner Brecht sat with his knees pulled to his chest, looking even younger than his years. His Hitler Youth uniform still bore the crisp creases his mother had pressed into it before he left home. 3 weeks ago, he had lied about his age to join, adding 2 years to seem more useful, more necessary. Now he regretted that lie with every fiber of his being. Rudiger Mathies, at 17 the oldest and most experienced, had actually seen combat twice before. He carried himself with a hardness that the others lacked, but even his bravado was beginning to crack as the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. The youngest, Erich Lindemann, had celebrated his 14th birthday just 5 days earlier with a piece of stale bread and a promise to himself that he would make Germany proud. They had been left behind when their unit retreated during the night, either forgotten in the chaos or deliberately abandoned as expendable. Now they faced an impossible choice: surrender to an enemy they had been taught to fear more than death itself, or fight until the Americans killed them all. As the sound of approaching tanks grew louder, Helmut looked at the faces of his makeshift squad and saw the same terror reflected in each pair of eyes. They were not soldiers, they were children playing at war, and the game was about to end. Helmut tried to remember exactly when his childhood had ended, but the memories blurred together like watercolors left in the rain. Perhaps it was the day his older brother Johann died at Stalingrad, when his mother stopped smiling and his father stopped speaking except to bark orders around the farm. Or maybe it was the morning Hitler youth leaders came to his school and sorted the boys by age and size, measuring them like livestock, to determine who was ready to serve. He had been proud that day, standing straight and tall, desperate to prove he was man enough to fight for Germany. That pride seemed like something from another lifetime now. Dieter's childhood had ended more abruptly. He could pinpoint the exact moment to when the telegram arrived informing his family of his father's death. His mother had collapsed in the doorway, and suddenly Dieter was the man of the house at 15, responsible for his 3 younger sisters and his grief-stricken mother. Joining the Volkssturm had seemed like the honorable thing to do, the thing his father would have wanted. Now, crouched in this ruined farmhouse, he wondered if his father would have wanted him to throw his life away in a war everyone knew was already lost. Klaus Werner's transformation from child to soldier had happened so gradually he barely noticed it. First came the Hitler Youth meetings, which seemed exciting and important. Then came the military drills, which made him feel strong and capable. Then came the rumors that even the youngest members might be called to fight, which filled him with equal parts terror and pride. When the actual call came, his mother had wept and begged him not to go, but the men in uniforms had made it clear that refusal meant disgrace for the entire family, possibly even accusations of treason. So he had gone, and his mother had pressed his uniform and packed him a lunch, as if he were simply going to school for the day. For Rudiger, childhood had been stolen piece by piece over years of relentless propaganda and militarization. He had been in Hitler Youth since age 10, had marched in countless parades, had memorized speeches about duty and sacrifice and the glory of dying for the fatherland. By 17, he could field strip a rifle blindfolded and knew a dozen different ways to kill a man. But he had never kissed a girl, never learned to drive a car, never done any of the normal things boys his age should have been doing. The war had consumed everything. Eric, the youngest, still clung to fragments of childhood even as he tried to act like a soldier. He carried a small wooden horse his grandfather had carved for him when he was 6, hidden in his uniform pocket where the others could not see it, and mock him for being a baby. Sometimes at night, he would hold it and pretend he was back home. In Saxony, playing in the fields behind his house, his biggest worry whether his mother would make potato soup or cabbage for dinner. Those memories felt impossibly distant now, like stories someone else had told him about a different boy's life. The American tanks were close enough now that the boys could hear the rumble of their engines over their own ragged breathing. Helmut knew they should have retreated hours ago, should have abandoned this indefensible position, and tried to make their way back to whatever remained of German lines. But pride and propaganda and the paralysis of fear had kept them frozen in place. They had been taught that German soldiers never retreated, never surrendered, fought to the last man and the last bullet. The fact that they were not really soldiers, just terrified children with rifles they barely knew how to use, did not seem to matter to anyone who had given them their orders. Rudiger took position at one of the farmhouse windows, sighting down his rifle at the approaching American column. His hands were steady, his face set in grim determination. He had seen what happened to boys who showed weakness, who questioned orders, who suggested that perhaps fighting to the death was not always the most sensible option. They were called cowards and traitors, sometimes shot by their own officers as examples to others. Better to die fighting Americans than to be executed as a deserter by fellow Germans. That was the logic that had brought them to this moment. Dieter tried to load his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the ammunition twice. Each time he bent to retrieve the scattered bullets, he felt shame burning in his chest. What would his father think of him now, trembling like a child afraid of the dark? His father had been a brave soldier who had fought and died for Germany. Dieter felt he owed it to his father's memory to be equally brave, even though everything inside him screamed to run away and hide. Klaus Werner had given up any pretense of being ready to fight. He sat against the wall, tears streaming down his face, whispering prayers his grandmother had taught him when he was small. He prayed for courage. He prayed for survival. He prayed that his mother would forgive him for lying about his age and getting himself killed so far from home. Most of all, he prayed that death would be quick and that it would not hurt too much. Eric clutched his wooden horse so tightly that the edges bit into his palm. He thought about his grandfather who had carved it, who had fought in the First Great War and had told Eric stories about the trenches and the gas attacks and the friends who never came home. His grandfather had said that war was not glorious or honorable, just necessary sometimes and terrible always. Eric had not understood what he meant then. He understood now. The sound of American voices carried across the field, shouting orders in a language the boys did not understand. Helmut looked at his squad, at these children pretending to be soldiers, and made a decision that would either save their lives or end them. Helmut stood up slowly, his rifle still in his hands but pointed at the floor. The other boys stared at him in shock and confusion. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Helmut walked to the farmhouse door, opened it, and stepped outside with his hands raised above his head, his rifle dangling from one finger by its strap. It was the bravest and most terrifying thing he had ever done. He expected to be shot immediately. Instead, he heard someone shout in English, followed by the sound of multiple rifles being cocked and aimed in his direction. American soldiers materialized from positions around the farmhouse, surrounding him with weapons trained on his chest. He stood perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for the bullets he was certain would come. One of the Americans, a sergeant with weathered face and kind eyes, approached cautiously. He looked at Helmut, really looked at him, and something shifted in his expression. He barked an order to his men, then spoke to Helmut in slow, careful English that the boy could not understand. When Helmut did not respond, the sergeant tried again in broken German. "How many inside?" Helmut's voice came out as barely a whisper. "4 more. All boys like me." The sergeant's expression hardened for a moment, then softened into something that might have been pity or disgust or both. He called out another order, and American soldiers moved toward the farmhouse entrance with weapons ready. Inside, the other 4 boys heard the commotion and understood what Helmut had done. Rudiger's face twisted with rage and betrayal. He raised his rifle toward the door, ready to shoot the first American who entered, ready to take at least one enemy with him before he died. But Dieter grabbed the barrel of Rudiger's rifle and pushed it down. "No," he said quietly, "it is finished. We are finished." For a long moment, Rudiger struggled against Dieter's grip, fury and shame and despair warring across his face. Then something inside him broke, and he let the rifle fall from his hands. Klaus Werner and Erich needed no convincing. They were already standing with their hands raised, tears still wet on their faces. American soldiers burst through the door, weapons ready, shouting commands in English. The boys stood frozen, hands above their heads, expecting execution at any second. The Americans searched them roughly, removing weapons and checking for hidden grenades or knives. When they found Erich's wooden horse, one soldier held it up questioningly. Erich flinched, certain they would mock him or destroy it. Instead, the soldier looked at the carved toy, looked at Erich's young, terrified face, and carefully placed the horse back in the boy's pocket with unexpected gentleness. The gesture was so unexpected, so contradictory to everything they had been taught about American cruelty, that Erich felt something crack inside his chest. The Americans marched them outside where Helmut stood under guard. The 5 boys were lined up against the farmhouse wall. This was it then. The execution they had been promised. The 5 boys stood against the farmhouse wall, hands still raised above their heads, waiting for the order to fire. Helmut kept his eyes open, refusing to give the Americans the satisfaction of seeing him cower. Beside him, Dieter had closed his eyes tightly and was muttering what sounded like the Lord's Prayer under his breath. Klaus Werner was crying openly now, his thin shoulders shaking with sobs he could no longer control. Rudiger stood rigid with fury, his jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. Erich simply stared at the ground, one hand still touching the pocket where his wooden horse rested, as if drawing comfort from that small connection to home and childhood. The American sergeant stood a few feet away, speaking quietly with another officer. The boys could not understand the words, but they caught the tone, serious and deliberate. They were deciding how to execute them, Helmut thought, perhaps debating whether to waste bullets on children or simply use bayonets to save ammunition. He had heard stories from older soldiers about such things, about how armies dealt with prisoners when resources were scarce, and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. He waited for the decision with a strange sense of calm that surprised him. After weeks of constant fear, there was almost relief in knowing it would end soon. But the execution order never came. Instead, the American sergeant barked a command, and soldiers lowered their weapons. Another order, and the boys were told through gestures to lower their hands. They obeyed slowly, uncertain if this was some kind of trick, waiting for the moment when guns would be raised again and the shooting would begin. Helmut's arms ached from being held up so long, but the physical discomfort barely registered compared to his confusion. What were the Americans doing? Why were they not being shot? One of the American soldiers, a young private, who looked barely older than Rudiger, approached it with canteens of water. He offered one to Helmut, who stared at it as if it might be poisoned. The private mimed drinking, then held it out again with something that almost looked like a smile. Helmut took the canteen with trembling hands and drank. The water was clean and cold, better than anything he had tasted in weeks. The private moved down the line, offering water to each boy in turn. Even Rudiger, despite his continued glaring defiance, accepted and drank deeply. The sergeant returned and spoke to them in his broken German. "You are prisoners now. You will not be hurt if you cooperate." The words seemed impossible, contradicted everything they had been taught about American brutality. Helmut wanted to believe it was true, but years of propaganda whispered warnings in his mind. This was a trick, a way to make them compliant before the real horrors began. Yet as minutes passed and no violence came, as American soldiers stood around them with weapons lowered rather than aimed, a tiny seed of hope began to grow in his chest. Perhaps, impossibly, they might survive this after all. Staff Sergeant William Harrison had been fighting across Europe for 11 months, from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. He had seen countless enemy soldiers, had captured dozens of prisoners, had witnessed death and destruction on a scale that still haunted his dreams. But nothing had prepared him for the moment when that first German boy walked out of the farmhouse with his hands raised. The kid could not have been more than 16, tall but skinny, with hollow cheeks that spoke of months of poor rations. When Harrison got close enough to see his face clearly, he felt like someone had punched him in the gut. The boy looked exactly like his own son back in Ohio. Michael Harrison was 15 years old, a sophomore in high school who played baseball and collected comic books and complained about having to do chores around the house. Before the war, Harrison had sometimes lost patience with his son's teenage sullenness, his reluctance to appreciate how good he had it, how easy his life was compared to the hardships Harrison's own generation had faced during the Depression. Now, looking at this German boy in an ill-fitting uniform, Harrison would have given anything to hear his son complain about homework or argue about his curfew. The war had given him a new perspective on what really mattered. When the other 4 boys emerged from the farmhouse, Harrison felt his stomach twist even tighter. They were all children, the youngest looking barely old enough to shave. One was actively crying, tears streaming down his face as he stood with his hands raised. Another clutched something in his pocket, his eyes wide with terror. These were not hardened Nazi soldiers. These were scared kids who had been given guns and told to fight, probably under threat of execution if they refused. Harrison had heard about Germany's desperate conscription of the Volkssturm, about how the Third Reich was throwing children into battle as their last desperate gamble. Seeing it up close made him feel sick. His fellow soldiers had looked to him for orders, their weapons trained on the boys. Some of them were angry, ready to shoot, fueled by months of combat and losses of friends and the hatred that war cultivates. Harrison could have given the order and no one would have questioned it. Enemy combatants who had been prepared to fight them, who might have killed American soldiers if given the chance, who wore the uniform of a regime that had brought unspeakable evil into the world. But Harrison looked at those 5 terrified faces and saw his own son. He saw his son's friends. He saw the boys from his neighborhood back home who played stickball in the street and saved their allowances to go to the picture show on Saturday afternoons. He gave the order to stand down, to treat them as prisoners rather than threats. Some of his men looked relieved. Others looked disappointed, robbed of the chance for revenge. Harrison did not care. He was tired of killing, tired of death, tired of a war that had apparently run so low on soldiers that it was sending children to die. These boys would be fed, would be processed as prisoners, would be kept safe until this whole damn war was finally over. 2 hours later, the 5 German boys sat in a larger American encampment, still trying to understand that they were alive and apparently not going to be executed. They had been searched again more thoroughly this time and separated briefly for questioning through an interpreter. The questions had been basic and almost disappointingly mundane. What unit were you with? How long have you been fighting? Where are your officers? The boys had answered honestly, too exhausted and confused to think about lying. They had no valuable intelligence to offer anyway. They were just children who had been left behind, forgotten casualties of a collapsing military machine. Now they sat together on the ground near a supply tent, under guard but not restrained. American soldiers moved around them with casual efficiency, going about the business of war as if 5 captured German boys were barely worth noticing. The lack of attention was somehow more unsettling than if they had been actively threatened. Helmut kept waiting for the moment when the Americans would reveal their true intentions, when the mask of civility would drop and the horrors they had been warned about would begin. But that moment never came. Instead, something happened that would change everything. A young American corporal approached, carrying a wooden crate. He set it down in front of the boys and opened it, revealing contents that made their eyes widen in disbelief. Food, not the watery soup and stale bread they had been surviving on for weeks, but real food in quantities they had almost forgotten existed. There were cans of meat, packages of crackers, chocolate bars, and something the boys did not recognize, wrapped in cloth and still warm. The corporal gestured for them to eat, his expression neither kind nor cruel, just matter of fact. When the boys hesitated, uncertain if this was a test or a trick, he mimed eating and pointed at them again. Eric reached for the warm bundle first, his hunger overcoming his caution. He unwrapped it carefully and found himself holding a thick square of golden bread, still steaming slightly, with a texture unlike anything he had seen before. He sniffed it cautiously. It smelled of corn and butter, and something sweet he could not identify. He took a small bite, then his eyes widened, and he took a larger one. The other boys watched him eat without dying or getting sick, and their own hunger quickly overcame their fear. Within moments, all 5 were eating with the desperate intensity of the half-starved. The cornbread was unlike anything in their German experience, slightly sweet, crumbly, rich with butter. To boys who had been surviving on increasingly meager rations, it tasted like something from a dream. The corporal returned with 10 cups of coffee, thick and strong and sweet with sugar. Real sugar, not the ersatz substitutes they had been drinking. The 5 boys ate in silence, too focused on the food to speak, too overwhelmed by the simple act of having enough to eat. Helmut tried to pace himself, tried to eat slowly and with dignity, but his body betrayed him. He stuffed cornbread into his mouth with both hands, barely chewing before swallowing, terrified that someone would take it away before he could finish. Beside him, Dieter had tears running down his face as he ate, though whether from relief or shame or simply the overwhelming sensation of a full stomach, even he could not have said. Klaus Werner ate more slowly, savoring each bite as if trying to memorize the taste, to hold on to this moment of abundance against future hunger. Rudiger ate mechanically, his face still hard with resentment, even as he accepted the American food. He hated himself for his weakness, for his hunger, for the fact that enemy charity tasted so good. He had been taught that accepting kindness from the enemy was a form of betrayal, that true German soldiers would rather starve than be corrupted by American softness. But his body did not care about ideology or national pride. His body was 17 years old and had been slowly starving for months, and it demanded that he eat everything offered to him. So he ate, hating himself with each bite, unable to stop. Eric finished his portion of cornbread and then did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He looked up at the American corporal who had brought the food and spoke in halting, careful German. "Thank you." The words hung in the air for a moment. The Corporal did not understand German, but the meaning was clear enough in the boy's tone and expression. He nodded once, then walked away to attend to other duties. It was such a small interaction, barely worth noting in the larger scope of the war. But for Eric, it was a moment of profound significance. He had thanked an enemy soldier for an act of kindness. The propaganda that had filled his head for years insisted that such a thing should be impossible, that Americans were incapable of kindness, that any apparent mercy was a trick designed to weaken German resolve. But the cornbread in his stomach was real. The warmth spreading through his body was real. The fact that he was alive when he had been certain he would die was real. These things could not be explained away by propaganda or dismissed as elaborate deception. Sergeant Harrison watched the boys eat from a distance, smoking a cigarette, and trying not to think too hard about what he was seeing. They were just kids, skinny, scared, dirty kids who had been given uniforms and rifles and told to fight a war they could not possibly win. Some of his fellow soldiers thought he was being too soft, that enemy soldiers deserved no mercy regardless of age. But Harrison had a son back home, and he could not look at these boys without seeing his own child's face. So he had ordered them fed, had made sure they got real food instead of just the bare minimum required by the Geneva Convention. Over the following days, a strange routine developed. The 5 German boys remained prisoners, kept under guard, and confined to a specific area of the American camp. But they were not mistreated. They were given regular meals, far better and more plentiful than anything they had eaten in months of German military service. They were provided with blankets and allowed to sleep in a supply tent rather than being left outside in the cold. They were even given access to basic medical care when the camp doctor noticed that Klaus Werner had a persistent cough that might develop into something serious. None of this matched what they had been taught to expect from American captivity. The language barrier created an odd dynamic. Most of the American soldiers spoke no German, and the boys' English was limited to a few basic phrases some had learned in school before the war. Yet communication happened anyway, through gestures and expressions, and the universal language of shared humanity. When Dieter struggled to understand an order about where prisoners should dispose of waste, a young American private named Torres drew pictures in the dirt until the meaning became clear. When Eric's wooden horse fell from his pocket and an American soldier picked it up, the boy flinched in fear that it would be taken or destroyed. Instead, the soldier examined the carving with apparent appreciation, then handed it back with a careful gentleness that spoke louder than any words could have. Helmut found himself becoming the unofficial leader of the German boys, not through any formal designation, but simply because the Americans seemed to have decided he was the one in charge. When Sergeant Harrison needed to communicate something to the prisoners, he would address Helmut directly, speaking slowly in English or broken German until understanding was reached. Helmut would then translate and explain to the others, a responsibility that felt both important and terrifying. He was constantly aware that any misunderstanding could have serious consequences, that his ability to bridge the language gap might be all that kept them safe. But it was the small moments that truly broke down barriers. When Klaus Werner's cough worsened, an American medic not only provided medicine but also brought him hot tea with honey, sitting with the boy until he fell asleep. When Rudiger, still resistant and angry, refused to eat one morning, Sergeant Harrison did not force him or punish him. He simply left the food nearby and walked away, allowing the boy to maintain his dignity while still ensuring he would not starve. By evening, the food was gone, eaten when no one was watching. These acts of quiet consideration, of treating the boys as human beings rather than just enemy prisoners, began to chip away at years of propaganda and indoctrination. The boys started to recognize individual American soldiers, to distinguish between the stern sergeant who seemed to be in charge, the young corporal who always smiled when he brought food, the medic with gentle hands who checked on Klaus Werner twice daily. They were not a faceless enemy army anymore. They were individual men with their own personalities and moods and habits, as distinct from each other as the German boys were from one another. The breaking point came on their 5th morning in captivity. The American cook, a heavy-set man from Louisiana named Private First Class James Butcher, prepared breakfast for the camp as he did every morning. But this day he made extras, portions of something special, and had it delivered to the German prisoners. The boys received plates piled high with scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, thick slices of bacon, and more of that cornbread they had come to associate with American generosity. There was so much food that Helmut thought there must be some mistake, that these portions were meant for multiple people, not just the 5 of them. But the American soldier who delivered the meal made it clear through gestures that this was indeed all for them. The boys stared at the abundance with something approaching disbelief. This was more food than they would have received in a week during their final months in German service. They had been taught that America was suffering under the weight of the war, that the American people were starving, that their economy was on the verge of collapse. Yet here was evidence that contradicted everything. These were not the rations of a struggling nation. This was the breakfast of a country with resources to spare, a country that could afford to feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. Dieter was the first to voice what they were all thinking. He looked at the heaping plate in his hands and spoke quietly in German. Everything they told us was a lie. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications that extended far beyond the immediate question of food. If the propaganda about American starvation was false, what else had been a lie? If Americans could show kindness to enemy prisoners, what else about them had been misrepresented? The foundation of everything the boys had believed about the war, about their enemies, about their own role in the conflict, was beginning to crack. Rudiger, still clinging to his anger and resistance, shook his head stubbornly. "It is a trick. They feed us well to make us weak, to make us betray Germany." But even as he spoke the words, his conviction wavered. He had been watching the American camp for days now, had seen how the soldiers treated each other, had observed their routines and their resources. This was not an army on the brink of collapse. These were not desperate men rationing their final supplies. The Americans had an abundance that made German military provisions look pitiful by comparison. Klaus Werner, his cough improving thanks to American medicine, asked the question none of them wanted to face directly. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? The boys ate their breakfast in troubled silence, each wrestling with implications they were not yet ready to fully acknowledge. The food was delicious and plentiful, and that simple fact was more subversive than any propaganda pamphlet could have been. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The German boys began to relax slightly in their captivity, their constant state of terror slowly giving way to cautious acceptance of their situation. They still did not fully trust the Americans, still half expected some terrible revelation or reversal, but the daily reality of decent treatment was becoming impossible to ignore. Helmut found himself watching the American soldiers with growing curiosity rather than fear, observing how they interacted with each other, how they went about their duties, how they seemed remarkably ordinary despite being the fearsome enemy he had been taught to hate. One afternoon, Sergeant Harrison approached the boys with a surprising request. The camp needed help unloading supply trucks, basic labor that did not require language skills or specialized knowledge. He asked through gestures and broken German if they would be willing to work. The question itself was startling because it was a question, not an order. They were prisoners. They could have been forced to work without any consultation. Yet Harrison was asking for their cooperation, offering them a choice. Helmut conferred with the others briefly, then agreed. The boys needed something to do. Anyway, needed some way to occupy their minds and hands beyond sitting and thinking about everything they had lost. Working alongside American soldiers provided new opportunities for connection. Private Torres, who had helped Dieter understand the camp layout, worked next to the German boys unloading crates of ammunition and supplies. He showed them the most efficient way to lift heavy boxes, demonstrated proper stacking techniques, and shared his canteen with them during breaks. There was no animosity in his treatment of them, no sense that he saw them as enemies or threats. To Torres, they were just workers helping with a job, and he treated them the same way he treated the other American soldiers performing the same labor. During one of these work sessions, Eric dropped a crate and it split open, spilling its contents across the ground. He froze in terror, certain he would be punished severely for damaging American military property. But the corporal in charge of the work detail simply shook his head, gestured for Eric to clean up the mess, and helped him repack the undamaged items. There was no shouting, no violence, no consequences beyond having to spend extra time fixing his mistake. The casual forgiveness of a simple accident was more shocking to Eric than harsh punishment would have been. Klaus Werner noticed other small kindnesses that accumulated over days and weeks. An American soldier who noticed him shivering brought an extra jacket without being asked. Another soldier, seeing the boys had no way to wash their clothes, showed them where they could do laundry and provided soap. These were not grand gestures or official policies, just individual acts of basic human decency. But to boys who had been taught that Americans were monsters incapable of compassion, each small kindness was a revelation that undermined everything they thought they knew about their enemy and their world. 3 weeks into their captivity, the boys were offered access to red, cross-letter writing materials. An interpreter explained that they could write to their families, that the letters would be processed through international humanitarian channels and eventually delivered to their homes in Germany. The offer seemed too good to be true, another potential trick designed to extract information or provide false hope. Yet the Americans seemed sincere, providing paper and pencils and privacy to write without observation. Helmut stared at the blank paper for a long time before he could bring himself to begin. What could he possibly say to his mother? How could he explain what had happened, where he was, what he had learned about the war and the enemy, and everything they had believed? He started the letter a dozen times, crossing out words that seemed inadequate or wrong. Eventually, he settled on simple facts, avoiding the larger questions that troubled him. He was alive. He was unhurt. He was being treated well by his captors. He asked about the farm, about his younger sister, about whether they had heard anything from the Eastern Front where the rest of their family lived. He did not mention the cornbread or the kindness or the growing suspicion that everything they had been told about America was a carefully constructed lie. Dieter wrote to his mother and sisters with tears streaming down his face, apologizing for failing them, for allowing himself to be captured, for not dying gloriously in defense of the fatherland as his father had. But even as he wrote these words of shame and apology, he found himself also describing the Americans who had shown him unexpected mercy, the food they had provided, the medicine they had given Klaus Werner. He could not reconcile these facts with the image of ruthless enemies he was supposed to maintain. His letter became a confused mixture of propaganda and truth, duty and doubt, shame and gratitude. Klaus Werner's letter to his mother was the shortest and simplest. He told her he was alive and safe, that he missed her terribly, that he hoped she would forgive him for lying about his age and joining the Volkssturm. He did not mention that he had expected to die, that he had been certain the Americans would execute him, that their unexpected kindness had shaken everything he thought he understood about the world. Some truths were too large and complicated to fit into a letter home. Rudiger refused to write at first, seeing the offer as another attempt to weaken their resolve and corrupt their loyalty. But watching the other boys carefully compose their letters, he felt his resistance crumbling. He missed his family desperately, had no idea if they were even alive after months of Allied bombing and Soviet advances from the east. Eventually, he wrote a brief letter to his parents stating only that he was a prisoner and being held according to Geneva Convention standards. He revealed nothing of his inner turmoil, nothing of how American kindness was forcing him to question everything he had been taught. As spring turned toward summer, news of Germany's total surrender spread through the American camp. The war in Europe was officially over. Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich had ceased to exist. For the 5 German boys, the announcement brought not relief, but profound confusion and uncertainty. They were no longer soldiers of a nation at war, but prisoners of a defeated country that had essentially stopped existing. What happened to them now? Would they be sent home to whatever remained of Germany? Would they be put on trial for their service to the Nazi regime? Would they simply be forgotten, left to languish in American custody indefinitely? Sergeant Harrison gathered them together with the interpreter to explain their situation. They would be processed as displaced persons, eventually repatriated to Germany once the Allies established proper systems for handling the millions of prisoners and refugees scattered across Europe. But the process would take time, possibly months. In the meantime, they would remain in American custody, continuing to receive the same treatment they had been getting. The news should have brought relief, but instead, it left the boys feeling adrift and purposeless. They were no longer soldiers, no longer serving any cause, just children waiting to return to a home that might not exist anymore. Helmut wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Part of him desperately wanted to return to Germany, to find his family, to see if his farm and his home had survived the war. But another part of him dreaded what he might find there. Reports filtering through the camp spoke of utter devastation, cities reduced to rubble, millions dead, the entire nation occupied by foreign powers. What kind of Germany would they be returning to? Would it even be recognizable as the country they had left? More troubling were the reports about what the Allies were discovering as they advanced into Germany, stories of concentration, camps of systematic murder on an industrial scale, of atrocities so enormous that the human mind struggled to comprehend them. The boys had heard whispers of such things before, but had dismissed them as enemy propaganda, lies designed to make Germans seem monstrous. Now, with the war over and the evidence mounting, those dismissals became harder to maintain. Had they been fighting for a cause that was not just defeated, but fundamentally evil? Had their service, however brief and involuntary, made them complicit in crimes they could barely imagine? Dieter voiced the question they were all thinking during one evening conversation. If we go back, what are we going back to? What kind of future exists for us there? The question hung in the air without answer. They were too young to have any real guilt for the Nazi regime's actions, had been children when the worst atrocities were committed. But they would still bear the mark of being German, of having worn the uniform, of having believed in something that had brought such horror into the world. How did someone rebuild a life from such ashes? As weeks turned into months and arrangements for repatriation slowly took shape, the 5 German boys found themselves facing an unexpected choice. Through the Red Cross and various humanitarian organizations, programs were being established to place some German prisoners, particularly the youngest ones, with American families willing to sponsor them. The idea was to give these children a chance at education and stability, while Germany underwent the massive reconstruction that lay ahead. It was not a formal immigration program, more of a temporary guardianship arrangement, but it represented a possibility none of them had imagined. Sergeant Harrison brought them the information through the interpreter, explaining carefully that this was entirely voluntary. They could choose repatriation to Germany as originally planned, or they could apply for placement with American families who had specifically requested to help young German prisoners. The offer came with significant conditions and no guarantees. They would need to attend school, learn English properly, follow American laws, and essentially start their lives over in a foreign country that had so recently been their enemy. Harrison made it clear that he understood how difficult such a decision would be. The boys' reaction split immediately and predictably. Rudiger rejected the idea almost before Harrison finished explaining it. To stay in America, to accept charity from the enemy, to abandon Germany in her moment of greatest need felt like the ultimate betrayal. Everything he had left might be destroyed. His family might be dead or scattered, but Germany was still his home. He had a duty to return, to help rebuild, to face whatever consequences came from having served the Reich, however briefly. Staying in America felt like running away, like choosing comfort over honor. Klaus Werner had the opposite reaction. He saw the offer as an unexpected gift, a chance to escape the devastation and shame that awaited him in Germany. His mother's last words to him had been a plea not to go to war, a plea he had ignored because he was 14 and stupid and believed the propaganda about glory and duty. How could he face her now, assuming she was even alive? How could he return to a Germany that had sent children to fight and die? America offered something Germany could not, a future unburdened by immediate ruins and consequences of defeat. Helmut found himself caught between these positions, understanding both perspectives and unable to fully commit to either. Part of him felt a deep obligation to return home, to find his family, to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. But another part recognized that staying in America might offer opportunities for education and advancement that would be impossible in occupied Germany. He had seen enough of American abundance to know that the two countries existed on entirely different levels of prosperity and possibility. Dieter remained characteristically uncertain, swaying between options with each new piece of information or argument from the others. Eric, the youngest, simply wanted someone to tell him what to do, to make the decision for him so he would not have to bear the weight of choosing wrongly. In the end, Rudiger's fierce insistence on honor and duty swayed Dieter to choose repatriation. The two older boys would return to Germany together, would face whatever they found there with the stubborn courage of those who refused to abandon their homeland regardless of cost. Helmut, after weeks of internal struggle, ultimately made the same choice. He could not abandon his family, could not simply start a new life in America, while his mother and sister might be suffering or dead. His sense of responsibility proved stronger than his desire for the opportunities America might offer. The three of them would return home. Klaus Werner and Eric chose to stay, to accept placement with American families, and begin the difficult process of building new lives in their former enemy's country. For Klaus Werner, the decision came from a recognition that he had nothing meaningful to return to. His family had lived in a part of Germany now under Soviet occupation, and the reports from that zone were particularly grim. Better to start fresh than to return to a place where he would be just another displaced person with no home and no prospects. Eric's choice was simpler and more emotional. He had found something in America he had never experienced in Germany, a sense of safety and possibility that he was not ready to surrender. The day of separation arrived in late August, 1945. The three boys choosing repatriation were processed along with hundreds of other German prisoners being returned to Europe. They were given clean clothes, basic supplies, and documentation identifying them as repatriated, prisoners of war. Sergeant Harrison shook each of their hands before they departed, a gesture of respect that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Through the interpreter, he wished them luck and told them that he hoped they would help build a better Germany than the one that had sent them to war. The farewell between the five boys was more emotional than any of them had expected. They had survived capture together, had shared fear and confusion, and the gradual transformation that came from discovering their enemies were human. Now they were choosing different paths, might never see each other again, would carry different memories of this strange period of their lives. Helmut embraced Klaus Werner and told him not to forget where he came from, even as he built a new life. Klaus Werner promised he would not, though both of them suspected that memory and identity would prove more flexible than such promises suggested. Rudiger, still angry and proud despite everything, refused to show emotion during the goodbye. But when Eric handed him the small wooden horse his grandfather had carved, asking him to keep it safe in case they ever met again, even Rudiger's hard exterior cracked slightly. He accepted the carved toy carefully, promised to protect it, and turned away quickly before anyone could see the tears in his eyes. The three boys bound for Germany boarded trucks that would take them to processing centers and eventually to ships crossing the Atlantic. They did not look back. Klaus Werner was placed with the Henderson family in rural Pennsylvania, a farming household with 3 daughters and no sons. Thomas Henderson was a veteran of the First World War who understood something about the cost of conflict and the importance of breaking cycles of hatred. His wife Margaret was a school teacher who saw in Klaus Werner a boy desperately in need of education and stability. The first months were difficult, marked by language barriers and cultural confusion, and the weight of being a former enemy living among those he had been taught to hate. But the Hendersons were patient and consistent in their kindness. They enrolled Klaus Werner in the local high school, where he struggled with English but excelled in mathematics and science. They took him to church on Sundays and included him in family dinners and treated him not as a charity case or a prisoner, but as a son. Slowly, painfully, Klaus Werner began to build a new identity. He started going by his middle name, Werner, which felt less conspicuously German. He learned to play baseball, though he never quite understood the appeal. He made friends with other boys his age who knew he was German, but did not seem to care. Eric's placement was with the Morrison family in Iowa, the same Private Morrison who had offered that first act of kindness with tea and blankets months ago. Morrison had returned home after the war and told his family about the German boys he had helped guard, about how young and scared they had been. His parents, farmers who had lost a son at Normandy, had initially resisted the idea of hosting a German child, but Morrison had persisted, arguing that hatred only perpetuated more hatred, that someone had to break the cycle. Eventually, they agreed, and Eric found himself on a farm in the American Midwest, learning to milk cows and drive tractors. The adjustment was hard, in ways Eric had not anticipated. The abundance that had seemed miraculous in the prison camp felt almost obscene when experienced daily. The Morrison family had enough food that they fed excess grain to livestock, had multiple sets of clothes, owned a truck and a car. Meanwhile, reports from Germany spoke of starvation and deprivation on a massive scale. Eric felt guilty for his comfort, ashamed that he was eating well while Germans starved. But Mrs. Morrison, understanding more than Eric realized, simply told him that he was not responsible for being born German any more than she was, responsible for being born American. What mattered was what he chose to do with the opportunities he was given. Both boys wrote letters to Helmut, Dieter, and Rudiger, sending them through Red Cross channels and hoping they would reach their destinations. The responses, when they came months later, painted a picture of devastation that made their own adjustment struggles seem trivial. Germany was a nightmare of rubble and refugees, of hunger and hopelessness, of a nation trying to rebuild from complete destruction. Their friends were alive, but barely surviving, scrounging for food and shelter in a country that had essentially ceased to function. In the summer of 2005, an elderly man named Werner Brecht stood in the arrivals hall of Frankfurt Airport, holding a sign with names written in careful script. Beside him stood another old man, white-haired and bent with age, but still recognizable after 6 decades. Eric Morrison, who had kept his adopted American surname, but had never quite stopped being Eric Lindemann in his own mind, had traveled from Iowa for this reunion. They were waiting for 3 men arriving from different parts of Germany, men they had not seen since that August day in 1945 when their paths had diverged. Helmut Schroeder emerged from customs first, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, His once tall frame stooped with age. He spotted Werner and Erich immediately, and his weathered face broke into a smile that erased 60 years in an instant. The three old men embraced with tears streaming down their faces, speaking rapidly in a mixture of German and English, voices overlapping as they tried to compress 6 decades into a few breathless sentences. Dieter Volkmann arrived next, accompanied by his daughter, who had helped arrange this improbable reunion. Finally, Rüdiger Mathis appeared, still carrying himself with the rigid bearing that had defined him even as a boy. The 5 of them sat together in a quiet corner of the airport, these old men who had once been terrified children, and began to share the stories of the lives they had lived since that long-ago summer. Helmut spoke of returning to a farm that no longer existed, of finding his mother and sister alive, but his home destroyed, of spending years helping to rebuild not just his family's property but entire villages. He had become a teacher eventually, had dedicated his life to ensuring that German children learned the truth about what their nation had done and why it must never happen again. Dieter had struggled more than the others, had spent years in poverty before finally establishing himself as a skilled tradesman. He had married late, had children who were now adults with children of their own. He spoke quietly about the guilt he still carried, not for anything he had personally done, but for having been part of something so monstrous, however unwittingly. Rüdiger had become a police officer, had spent his career trying to uphold law and justice in a nation rebuilding its moral foundations. He still carried Erich's wooden horse, kept it on his desk as a reminder of choices made and paths not taken. Werner told of his life in America, of becoming a mechanical engineer, of marriage and children and grandchildren who barely believed the stories of their grandfather's youth. Erich spoke of the farm in Iowa, of the Morrison family who had given him a home, of the debt he could never fully repay to people who had shown mercy to their enemy's child. Both of them had returned to Germany many times over the years, had maintained connections with their homeland even as they built American lives. The 5 old men spent 3 days together in Germany, visiting the places where their younger selves had been shaped by war and its aftermath. They traveled to what had been the American camp where they were held, though nothing remained of it now except an empty field and a small historical marker. They stood together on that ground where they had once waited for execution that never came, where they had tasted cornbread and experienced kindness from those they had been taught were monsters. The memory of those days remained vivid despite the decades that had passed. On their final evening together, they gathered for dinner at a restaurant in Frankfurt. The conversation turned inevitably to the question that had defined their lives since that summer of 1945. Had they made the right choices? Should those who stayed have returned? Should those who returned have stayed? The answers, they discovered, were less important than the fact that they had been given choices at all. In a war that had stolen agency from millions, that had turned children into soldiers and reduced nations to rubble, they had been offered a genuine decision about their futures. That gift, more than the cornbread or the medical care or any other kindness, was what they had carried with them through their lives. Werner spoke about visiting Sergeant Harrison's grave in Ohio 3 years earlier. The old sergeant had died in 1998, had lived a long life, and never spoke much about the war. But his son had told Werner that his father kept a photograph of 5 German boys in his desk drawer until the day he died. That he had said more than once that showing mercy to those children was the thing he was most proud of from his entire military service. The revelation had moved Werner to tears. The man who had saved their lives had considered their survival his greatest achievement. Rüdiger, ever the practical one, pointed out that their story was a tiny footnote in a war that had killed millions. What did 5 German boys matter in the scope of such devastation? But Helmut disagreed gently. Perhaps they mattered precisely because the war was so large and terrible. Perhaps the only way to comprehend something as monstrous as World War was to understand it through individual moments of Choice through specific decisions made by particular people at crucial moments. Sergeant Harrison could have ordered their execution. The American cook could have given them minimal rations. The medic could have ignored Klaus Werner's cough. Each small choice had rippled forward through decades. As they said their final goodbyes, knowing this would likely be the last time all five were together, Eric returned the wooden horse to Rudiger. "Keep it," Rudiger said. "You gave it to me 60 years ago. Now I am giving it back. Let your grandchildren have it. Let them know the story of how cornbread and compassion can change the trajectory of lives, how enemies can become brothers, and how even in humanity's darkest hours, individual people can still choose mercy over hatred."